There comes a point in the empath's healing where something subtle, almost invisible, changes. Nothing dramatic happens on the outside. No big confrontation. No final conversation. No emotional explosion. But inside, something stops pulling. The empath notices they are no longer rehearsing conversations in their head. No longer preparing explanations that will never be received. No longer waiting for the moment someone finally understands what they've already explained 100 times. And when this happens, the world around them reacts before they do. People start saying things like, "You've changed. You're colder than you used to be. You don't care anymore." What they are really noticing is not a loss of empathy. They are noticing the absence of access. Because for a long time, the empath's emotional energy was available on demand. If someone was confused, the empath explained. If someone was distant, the empath tried harder. If someone was hurt, the empath absorbed it. And then, quietly, that pattern ends. The empath doesn't announce it. They don't justify it. They don't even fully understand it yet. They just stop feeling the pull. This is the moment most people misunderstand. From the outside, it looks like detachment, like withdrawal, like emotional shutdown. But Carl Jung recognized something very different. He observed that this moment was not regression. It was not defense. And it was not damage. It was the final phase of healing. Jung spent much of his life studying what happens when a person stops living from unconscious emotional obligation and begins living from internal truth. What he found was that empaths, more than anyone, struggle at the very end of this process. Not at the beginning, not in the middle, but at the moment when release becomes irreversible. Because up until now, healing still allowed hope. Hope that the relationship might improve. Hope that the person might change. Hope that if the empath stayed available just a little longer, something would finally resolve. The final release is different. It doesn't feel hopeful. It doesn't feel empowering. And it doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels quiet. The empath simply notices that the emotional charge is gone. The same person who once triggered anxiety, sadness, or longing is mentioned, and nothing happens inside. No tightening in the chest. No urge to explain. No need to be seen. Not because the empath is numb, but because something has completed. Jung understood this completion as individuation reaching its final psychological threshold. The moment when the psyche no longer sends energy toward what cannot reciprocate. This is why the final release frightens people. Not the empath, but the people who were still connected to the old version of them. Because when an empath truly lets go, they don't argue. They don't defend. They don't chase closure. They simply become unmoved. And for the first time, their peace no longer depends on anyone else's behavior. What makes this stage so confusing is that it doesn't come from effort. You don't force yourself to detach. You don't decide to stop caring. The caring exhausts itself. The hope runs out. The nervous system finally accepts what the mind already knew. And when that alignment happens, something irreversible occurs. The empath releases. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. This is not the end of empathy. It's the end of emotional self-abandonment. And once this release begins, the rest of life reorganizes around it. For many empaths, healing appears to be working long before it's actually complete. They've gained insight. They understand their patterns. They can name their wounds. They've learned the language of boundaries. From the outside, they look healed. But inside, something is still tethered. This is where Jung noticed a quiet but dangerous illusion. The empath believes they've moved on. Yet their emotional body hasn't caught up with what their mind already knows. They no longer tolerate obvious harm. They no longer stay in openly abusive dynamics. They no longer abandon themselves in the ways they once did. And still, certain people retain emotional access. not because the empath wants them to, but because the attachment was never conscious to begin with. This is the phase Jung would have recognized as partial individuation. The personality has evolved. The awareness has expanded, but the nervous system is still wired to old bonds. So the empath lives in two realities at once. In one reality, they know the truth. They know who this person is. They know the relationship is unhealthy. They know nothing new is going to happen. And yet, in another reality, their body still reacts. A name comes up, and there's a subtle tightening in the chest. A memory surfaces, and the mood shifts for the rest of the day. They say they don't care, but something inside still listens. This split is exhausting, because it requires constant regulation. The empath is always managing themselves, talking themselves down, reminding themselves why it doesn't matter, convincing themselves they are over it. And the longer this goes on, the more draining it becomes. Jung understood that this wasn't weakness. It was unfinished integration. The empath's consciousness had outgrown the relationship, but their emotional system was still bonded to the role they once played inside it. Often, that role was formed very early. The role of the one who understands, the one who adapts, the one who absorbs tension so others don't have to. This is why intellectual clarity alone is never enough. You can understand for years why someone isn't good for you, and still feel emotionally hooked to them. You can articulate your boundaries perfectly, and still feel destabilized when they are crossed. You can stop engaging outwardly, and still be pulled inwardly. This is the trap of being almost healed. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it feels like constant vigilance. The empath is no longer drowning, but they are still swimming against a current that never stops. Jung recognized this state as a form of psychological bondage, not because the empath lacks freedom, but because part of their energy is still being sent outward, unconsciously. There is still a subtle hope at work, not the obvious hope that things will suddenly change, but the quieter hope that something unresolved will finally resolve itself. That one day, the person will see. That one day, the dynamic will soften. That one day, the effort will be reciprocated. As long as that hope exists, detachment cannot complete, because hope keeps the emotional cord alive. And this is the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. You don't fully release someone. When you understand them, you release them. When your body no longer expects anything from them. That moment doesn't arrive through willpower. It arrives when the psyche is finally ready to stop investing energy where there is no return. Until then, the empath may look calm on the surface, but inside, they are still negotiating with something that should already be over. This is why the final release feels so different. When it comes, there is no debate, no inner dialogue, no regulation required. The split disappears. What the empath knows, and what the empath feels, finally become the same thing. And when that alignment happens, the attachment doesn't weaken. It ends. Carl Jung noticed something that didn't fit the usual narrative of healing. His most empathic patients would come into therapy having done real work. They understood their childhood wounds. They recognized unhealthy patterns. They had learned to say no. And yet, certain people still devastated them. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. The reaction was always there. Then, without warning, something would change. A patient would talk about the same person who once triggered anxiety, longing, or sadness, and the charge would be gone. Not muted, not controlled, not pushed away. Gone. Jung paid close attention to this moment because it didn't behave like defense. There was no tension in the body, no emotional suppression, no effort to stay composed. The patient wasn't bracing themselves. They were simply neutral. The story was the same. The person hadn't changed. The history was still there. but the emotional cord that once connected the two had quietly disconnected from the nervous system. This is where many people get confused. They assume detachment means not feeling, or closing the heart, or becoming indifferent. But what Jung was witnessing was not indifference. It was completion. Earlier stages of healing still require management. The empath has to regulate their reactions. They remind themselves why they shouldn't engage. They consciously choose not to respond. In this stage, there is no choice being made. There is nothing to manage. The empath doesn't have to be strong. They don't have to resist an urge. There is no urge. Jung understood this as psychological sovereignty. The moment when the psyche stops sending energy toward a dynamic that cannot reciprocate. Energy that had been leaking for years suddenly returns to its source. And when that happens, something profound shifts. The empath's inner world becomes quieter. Not empty, but steady. They are no longer pulled into emotional gravity fields that don't belong to them. Other people's moods stop reorganizing their internal state. Not because the empath has hardened, but because their system is no longer available for unconscious participation. This is what makes the final release so unmistakable. There is no inner debate. No part of the empath argues for one more chance. No part insists on explaining. No part believes that something is still unresolved. The bond doesn't weaken. It dissolves. And when it does, the empath doesn't feel victorious. They feel clear. Jung noted that this clarity is often mistaken for coldness by those observing from the outside. But from the inside, it feels like a return of energy, a return of attention, a return of self. This is the moment the empath stops living in reaction and starts living from internal truth, not because they tried to detach, but because there is nothing left to detach from. This is where many empaths get lost. Once they hear about detachment, they try to make it happen. They tell themselves they should be over it by now. They try to let go through discipline. They attempt to detach through understanding. But Jung was clear about this. What completes naturally cannot be manufactured. The final release does not arrive through effort. It arrives when effort is no longer required. This is why forced detachment so often turns into something else entirely. It becomes emotional suppression, or intellectual distancing, or a kind of spiritual bypassing that looks calm on the surface but keeps tension locked in the body. The empath tells themselves they don't care, but their nervous system hasn't agreed. They withdraw, but they are still watching. They stop responding, but they are still reacting internally. They build walls, but the emotional cord remains intact behind them. Jung distinguished very carefully between detachment and dissociation. Dissociation is a splitting away from feeling. Detachment is a completion of feeling. One creates numbness. The other creates clarity. This is why the final phase of healing often arrives after a long period of exhaustion. Not dramatic exhaustion, quiet exhaustion. The kind where the empath realizes they cannot keep regulating themselves forever. They cannot keep managing emotional dynamics that never resolve. They cannot keep explaining truths that are consistently ignored. They cannot keep investing energy into people who are not meeting them halfway. At some point, the psyche stops negotiating. Not out of anger, out of self-preservation. This is an important distinction. The empath does not detach because they are fed up. They detach because their system has finished learning. Jung believed that the psyche seeks balance above all else. When an empath gives far more than they receive for too long, the psyche eventually compensates. It withdraws energy from the external object and redirects it inward. This redirection is not a conscious choice. It is a biological and psychological correction. And when this correction begins, resistance only delays it. Trying to be detached keeps the empath stuck in performance. They are still orienting around the other person, still monitoring their reactions, still measuring progress by how little they feel. True release is quieter than that. There is no monitoring. The empath simply notices that the emotional labor has stopped. They are no longer bracing themselves before interactions, no longer replaying conversations afterward, no longer thinking about what they should have said. The mind becomes less occupied because the emotional investment has ended. This is why people often mistake the final release for apathy. From the outside, it looks like the empath has checked out. From the inside, it feels like they've finally checked back in. This stage cannot be rushed, because it requires something the empath usually avoids: letting the disappointment finish its work, not fixing it, not reframing it, not turning it into insight, allowing it to complete. And once it does, the release is no longer something the empath tries to maintain. It maintains itself. There is one part of the final release that almost no one talks about, because it doesn't feel like healing. It feels like grief. Not the kind of grief most people recognize. Not loud. Not explosive. Not cathartic. This grief is quiet. It arrives after the empath has already understood everything. After they've processed the trauma. After they've set boundaries. After they've made peace with the story. Or at least, they thought they had. What remains is not pain over what happened. It is sorrow for what never did. Jung understood that the deepest attachments are not maintained by memory, but by expectation. The expectation that one day the person would finally see. That one day the relationship would soften. That one day the effort would be returned. As long as that expectation lives, the emotional cord stays alive. The final release requires mourning something very specific. Not the person, but the future the empath kept investing in. This is where the grief becomes difficult to face, because it means accepting that some relationships will never transform, no matter how much insight, patience, or love is offered. It means accepting that certain people were never capable of meeting the empath in the way they needed. And that truth is devastating, not because it hurts, but because it closes the door permanently. Many empaths try to skip this grief. They tell themselves they are already past it. That revisiting sadness means regression. That feeling sorrow again means they haven't healed. But Jung saw the opposite. He observed that unfinished grief keeps the psyche attached. Hope is not always healthy. Sometimes it is the mechanism that prolongs suffering. This grief is not about blame. It is not about resentment. It is not about reliving the story. It is about letting the fantasy dissolve. The fantasy that the parent would eventually become emotionally available. The fantasy that the partner would change once they felt safe enough. The fantasy that the friend would finally reciprocate if given enough chances. When that fantasy collapses, the empath often feels a profound stillness, a sadness without drama, a heaviness without urgency. They may feel tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. They may become quieter, less interested in explaining themselves, less interested in being understood. This is not withdrawal. This is mourning. Jung recognized that this stage cannot be rushed. Some people move through it quickly. Others return to it in waves. But each time it completes a little more. The emotional cord weakens. Until one day, it simply isn't there anymore. The empath realizes they are no longer waiting, no longer scanning for signs, no longer imagining alternative outcomes. The hope that once kept them tethered has gently released its grip. And with that release comes something unexpected. Relief. Not joy. Not empowerment. Relief. The relief of no longer carrying an emotional future that was never going to arrive. The relief of no longer trying to earn what should have been freely given. The relief of finally allowing reality to be what it is. This is the grief that heals. Not because it feels good, but because it completes something that has been unfinished for far too long. And once this grief finishes its work, the release no longer feels like loss. It feels like closure that came from within. When the empath reaches this stage, something subtle but disruptive happens in the system around them. Not inside them, around them. Because for a long time, the empath played a stabilizing role. They absorbed tension. They softened conflict. They adjusted themselves so others didn't have to. And when that role quietly ends, the system feels it immediately. People begin reacting in ways that confuse the empath. Some become irritated. Some become anxious. Some become suddenly critical. They say things like, "You're not the same anymore. You've changed. You used to be more caring." But what they are actually responding to is the loss of access. The empath is no longer available for unconscious emotional labor. They are no longer regulating other people's discomfort. They are no longer smoothing over dysfunction. They are no longer stepping in to restore emotional balance that was never theirs to manage. Jung understood this reaction very clearly. He knew that systems do not protest when something unimportant is removed. They protest when a stabilizing function disappears. Family members who relied on the empath to absorb emotional chaos are suddenly forced to face their own unresolved issues. Friends who were accustomed to taking without giving feel destabilized when the empath stops compensating. Partners who depended on guilt, confusion, or emotional pressure find that those tools no longer work. This is when accusations begin. The empath is told they are cold, selfish, unforgiving, too distant. Sometimes others claim the empath is holding grudges or refusing to move on. But Jung would tell you that these accusations are not about healing. They are about control. When an empath detaches, they stop being predictable. They stop responding in the expected way. They stop engaging in familiar emotional loops. And people who benefited from those loops feel threatened by the change. What makes this phase especially challenging is that the empath may still care. They may still feel compassion. They may still wish others well. But compassion without self-abandonment feels very different to people who were used to unlimited access. So they escalate. They recruit others to pressure the empath. They reinterpret the past. They question the empath's motives. They frame boundaries as cruelty. Jung recognized this as a defensive reaction. When a system loses someone who was carrying its imbalance, it tries to restore equilibrium by pulling that person back into place. This is why the pressure often increases, right after the empath stops engaging. And this is where clarity becomes essential. The empath begins to see something they couldn't see before. That not everyone who claims to be hurt is actually being harmed. Some are simply uncomfortable because they can no longer offload their emotional weight. This realization changes how the empath responds. They stop arguing their case. They stop defending their intentions. They stop trying to prove that they are still good, still kind, still caring. Not because they don't care what others think, but because they understand something new. People who require you to abandon yourself in order to feel loved are not responding to your growth. They are resisting it. Jung would say this resistance is confirmation. Not that you are right in every decision, but that a real shift has occurred. The empath's center of gravity has moved. They are no longer oriented around maintaining harmony at any cost. They are oriented around truth. And truth, when it arrives quietly and firmly, often feels cold to those who depended on confusion. What emerges after the final release is not a hardened person. It's an integrated one. The empath does not lose sensitivity. They lose compulsion. They still feel deeply, but they no longer feel automatically. They no longer rush toward emotional intensity. They observe patterns before investing. They listen to actions more than words. This is one of the most misunderstood shifts. From the outside, it can look like distance. From the inside, it feels like discernment. The empath no longer mistakes familiarity for safety. They no longer confuse emotional urgency with intimacy. They no longer stay loyal to people who consistently violate their peace. Jung believed this was a sign of psychological maturity. The psyche is no longer fragmented between what it knows and what it tolerates. The empath becomes selective, not out of fear, but out of self-respect. This is also when the relationship with solitude changes. Before, being alone felt like rejection, or abandonment, or failure. After the release, solitude becomes restorative. Not because the empath doesn't want connection, but because they are no longer seeking themselves through others. They have become their own anchor. Jung warned, however, that this stage is not about isolation. The goal of detachment is not disconnection. It is conscious connection. The integrated empath is capable of deep intimacy, but only with those who demonstrate consistency, reciprocity, and emotional responsibility. They are no longer available to rescue. They are available to relate. This is what Jung meant by wholeness. Not needing others to complete you, while still being able to meet them fully. If you're in this phase, you may be feeling something that's hard to explain. You're watching situations that once consumed you from a place of neutrality. You're noticing manipulation where you once felt guilt. You're feeling nothing where you once felt everything. And you may be wondering if something has gone wrong. Jung would tell you that nothing is wrong. You haven't lost your empathy. You've lost your tolerance for emotional self-abandonment. You haven't become cold. You've become conscious. You no longer need closure from people who never had the capacity to give it. You no longer need to be understood by those who were committed to misunderstanding you. You no longer need permission to protect your peace. This is the final release, not the end of love, but the end of loving at your own expense. Not the end of connection, but the end of unconscious attachment. You are not half of something waiting to be completed. You are whole. And from that wholeness, you get to choose who has access to you, who earns your vulnerability, and who no longer does. That is not selfishness. That is psychological health. That is individuation. And that is the beginning of a life, no longer organized around survival, but around truth.